At family dinner, husband sold my cabin for $60,000. My revenge left them broke and gave me freedom. My husband said, "I sold your little cabin for $60,000. His family cheered, calling it a smart move. He looked at me and said, "The money for this dinner? It's from the cabin sale. At least one meal is covered. I just stayed quiet." Then the buyer's lawyer called, screaming, "Why are the authorities at our office?" Something didn't feel right. The Whitmore family dinner was in full swing when Owen stood up, tapping his fork against Margaret's best crystal. "Before we eat, I have something important to share," he said, his voice carrying the authority he rarely displayed. "You all know about Violet's little cabin, her impractical purchase 3 years ago." My shoulders tensed at his tone. "Well, I finally did something about it. I sold it for $60,000 last month while she was overseas." The words hung in the air as he pointed to the elaborate spread on the table. "The money for this dinner, it's from the cabin sale. At least one meal is covered." His family laughed and applauded, but I stayed silent, my phone already vibrating with a call that would change everything. "Why are the authorities at our office?" The buyer's lawyer would scream moments later, his panic confirming what I already suspected. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here. If you believe that every woman's achievements deserve recognition, not dismissal, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps these important stories reach others. Now, let's see what happened next. But let me explain how I ended up at this table, surrounded by people who had made dismissing me into an art form. 6 years of marriage to Owen Whitmore had taught me the precise boundaries of my invisibility. That morning, like every morning, I had risen at dawn to prepare his coffee, 2 sugars, no cream. While he scrolled through his phone at our kitchen table, my greeting went unacknowledged, as usual. The breakfast I prepared was consumed in silence, punctuated only by the sound of his chewing and the occasional notification ping from his fantasy football group. Margaret had called while I was cleaning up, speaking only to Owen about Sunday's menu, despite knowing I would be the one spending 6 hours in the kitchen preparing her complicated requests. "Make sure Violet knows about the roast," she had said, as if I were hired help rather than her daughter-in-law, and tell her not to oversalt the potatoes like last time. The potatoes had been perfectly seasoned, but in the Whitmore family, my efforts were always somehow lacking. The pattern had been established early in our marriage. When I received my promotion at the consulting firm, a 30% raise and a corner office that I had earned through 18 months of 70-hour weeks. Owen's response was a distracted mumble about how it was about time I contributed meaningfully to our finances. The next evening, his brother Mason had scratched off a $50 lottery winner at that same dinner table, and the family erupted in celebration. Margaret insisted on taking photos, while Richard proposed a toast to Mason's good fortune and financial acumen. The Whitmore family dynamics revealed themselves through 1,000 small cruelties that had accumulated like sediment over the years. Margaret consistently forgot to set a place for me at holiday dinners until Owen noticed and mentioned it. Richard discussed finances with Owen while I sat right there, invisible as furniture, even though my salary had exceeded Owen's for the past 2 years. Mason borrowed money he never repaid, always joking that I probably tracked every penny in a spreadsheet, which I did, though not for the reasons he assumed. During their weekly family dinners, my accomplishments became footnotes, while Owen's mediocre sales numbers were dissected and praised as if he were revolutionizing his industry. The month I landed a $1 million contract for my firm, the dinner conversation focused entirely on Owen closing a deal worth less than my monthly commission. When I mentioned my achievement, Margaret had said, "That's nice, dear," before immediately asking Owen about his prospects for the next quarter. These patterns had driven me to create my own small rebellion. 3 years ago, I had opened a savings account that Owen knew nothing about. Every freelance project I took on, every lunch I skipped, every coffee I didn't buy went into that account. I watched the balance grow slowly, each deposit a small act of defiance against their assumption that everything I earned belonged to Owen by default. The cabin had been my first major purchase from that account, 2 acres of pine forest 40 miles from our suburban life, with a creaky deck overlooking a small pond. When Owen discovered it through a credit report he pulled for a car loan application, his rage had filled our house for weeks. Margaret and Richard had arrived within hours of his call, ready to lecture me about marriage being about transparency and trust. "What kind of wife keeps secrets?" Margaret had demanded, while Richard questioned my mental stability. but the cabin had become my sanctuary. Every Friday afternoon, I drove north with my coffee and notebooks, spending weekends in peaceful silence. Owen refused to visit, calling it my midlife crisis shack. His family created a narrative where my cabin represented everything wrong with our marriage, my selfishness, my impracticality, my failure to be a proper wife. 4 months ago, my firm had won a major contract with a defense contractor. The assignment required someone with high-level security clearance to coordinate offices across Asia. The selection committee chose me over 12 other candidates, recognizing my expertise in international compliance. Owen's first response wasn't pride, but suspicion. Why would they send a woman alone overseas, he had asked, while Margaret suggested I was abandoning my marital duties. Before leaving, I had arranged everything meticulously. The cabin's ownership had been registered with federal databases due to my security clearance, a detail that transformed my simple property into a protected asset. I left Owen detailed emergency-only instructions, automated all payments, and hired a property management service. His dismissive laugh when I explained the precautions still echoed in my memory. Now, sitting at this dinner table, watching Owen bask in his family's approval for selling my cabin, my sanctuary, my achievement, my freedom, I felt the phone vibrating again in my pocket. Harrison Blackwell, the caller ID read. I had never heard of him before, but somehow I knew this call would explain why Owen's proud announcement was about to become the worst decision of his life. I excused myself from the table, stepping onto the Whitmore's back porch with my phone pressed against my ear. Harrison Blackwell's voice trembled through the speaker, describing federal agents examining documents, asking questions about property sales that required special clearances. Behind me, through the glass doors, Owen was pulling out papers from a leather folder, showing his family the details of his brilliant transaction, while Margaret poured more wine. 3 years earlier, the journey to that cabin had started with a different phone call. Ruth Morrison, the elderly owner, had a voice like warm honey when she first described the property. It's not fancy, she'd warned. My husband built most of it himself after he retired from the railroad, but there's something special about those woods. They know how to keep secrets. I had driven out there on a Tuesday morning when Owen thought I was at a dental appointment. The narrow dirt road wound through towering pines that filtered the October light into golden patches. When the trees opened to reveal the cabin, something in my chest uncloaked for the first time in years. 2 stories of weathered cedar siding, a metal roof gone green with age, and that deck slightly tilted but solid overlooking a pond so still it looked like polished glass. Ruth had been waiting on the front steps, her white hair pinned back, wearing a flannel shirt that probably belonged to her late husband. She walked me through each room, running her weathered hands along door frames and window sills like she was saying goodbye to old friends. In the main bedroom, she stopped at a window that faced east. Harold used to say the sunrise through these pines was better than church, she said softly. I think he was right. When she named her price, it was less than market value by at least $20,000. I don't need the money, she explained, studying my face with eyes that seemed to see everything. I need to know it's going to someone who needs this place the way Harold and I did, someone who understands that sometimes 4 walls and silence are the only medicine that works. The down payment represented 3 years of skipped lunches, declined dinner invitations, and clothes worn long past their prime. Every dollar saved had been a small act of rebellion against the Whitmore family's assumption that I existed solely as an extension of Owen. My hands shook as I signed the papers in Ruth's kitchen, using my maiden name Violet Chin on every line. When she handed me the keys, they felt heavier than metal should, weighted with possibility. For 2 weeks, I kept my secret, driving out there alone to walk through my rooms, to sit on my deck, to breathe air that belonged to me. I fixed small things, a cabinet door that wouldn't close, a faucet that dripped learning from hardware store employees and YouTube videos. Each repair felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that the Whitmores had tried to erase. Owen's discovery came through pure accident. He decided to refinance his precious BMW and needed my signature on the credit application. The loan officer's computer screen faced me as she pulled our credit reports, and there it was in black and white, recent inquiry, Pine Grove Mortgage Company. Owen's face went from confusion to comprehension to rage in the span of 3 seconds. The drive home was silent, but once we were inside, the explosion came. You bought property without telling me? With what money? His voice climbed with each question. Within an hour, Margaret's Lexus screeched into our driveway, followed by Richard's Mercedes. Owen had summoned his parents like calling in reinforcements for battle. They arranged themselves in our living room like a tribunal. Margaret sat perfectly straight on our sofa, her pearls catching the light as she leaned forward. "Violet, darling," she began in that voice that made endearment sound like a threat. "Help us understand what kind of wife makes major financial decisions without consulting her husband." Richard stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back like he was delivering a boardroom presentation. "This raises serious concerns about your mental state, Violet. Hidden money, secret purchases, these are not the actions of a stable person." I sat in the chair they'd positioned to face all three of them, my hands folded in my lap. "The cabin cost $45,000, I said calmly. "I paid for it entirely with my own earnings from freelance work. It didn't affect our joint finances at all." "That's not the point." Owen's fist hit the coffee table, making Margaret's teacup rattle. "We're supposed to be partners. Partners don't keep secrets." The irony of Owen talking about partnership when he hadn't noticed my absence for dozens of Saturdays, hadn't asked about my freelance projects, hadn't even remembered our last 3 anniversaries was so thick I could taste it. But I stayed silent, having learned long ago that defending myself only gave them more ammunition. The next few months became a war of attrition. Owen refused to visit the cabin, calling it my midlife crisis shack to anyone who would listen. His family crafted a narrative where my cabin represented everything wrong with our marriage, my selfishness, my deception, my failure to be a proper wife. They told the story at every family gathering, to every mutual friend, until it became accepted truth that poor Owen was married to an unstable woman who hid money and bought property behind his back. But every Friday afternoon, I packed a small bag and drove north. Those weekends became my salvation. I learned to replace broken boards, to identify bird calls, to grow tomatoes in containers on the deck. I wrote in journals, filling pages with thoughts I couldn't speak aloud. The cabin learned my secrets, how I dreaded Sunday dinners, how I sometimes sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes gathering strength to go inside my own house, how I'd started marking days on a private calendar, not to count towards something, but to prove I was surviving. Margaret escalated her campaign with what she called a family meeting, but was actually an intervention. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation, actually created slides detailing the cabin's supposed maintenance costs, liability issues, and drain on our resources. She'd researched septic system failures, roof replacement costs, and property tax increases, presenting each as inevitable catastrophe. Mason made jokes about me becoming a hermit woman, asking if I was growing marijuana in the woods. Richard questioned whether I was meeting someone there, his implication clear. Owen sat silent through it all, letting them speak for him as he always did, his silence more damaging than their words. When they finally stopped talking, I pulled out my phone and showed them photos, the garden I'd planted, now growing wild with herbs and vegetables, the desk I'd positioned by the window where morning light flooded in, the bookshelves I'd built myself, slightly crooked but functional. Their faces remained unmoved, seeing only evidence of time spent away from them, energy directed towards something beyond their control. They stared at my photos for exactly 3 seconds before Margaret closed my phone and handed it back to me with the same expression she wore when returning spoiled food at a restaurant. "Well," she said, adjusting her pearls, "I suppose everyone needs their hobbies." The word hobbies dripped with enough condescension to fill the pond behind my cabin. 2 months after that disastrous intervention, everything shifted. My managing director, James Harrison, called me into his office on a Monday morning in February. The view from the 32nd floor showed the city wrapped in winter fog, and James stood against it like a general planning a campaign. "We've won the Raytheon contract," he said without preamble. 4 months coordinating their satellite offices across Asia. "It's worth $12 million to the firm, and I need someone with your specific expertise." The project required high-level security clearance due to defense contracts. 12 candidates had been considered. My name sat at the top of the list, circled twice in James's distinctive red pen. "Your background check came back spotless," he said, sliding the folder across his mahogany desk. "Your experience with international compliance is unmatched in this office. The client specifically requested someone with your qualifications." I accepted immediately, the word yes escaping before I could second-guess myself. 4 months away from the Whitmores felt like being offered oxygen after years of suffocation. James smiled. the kind that suggested he understood more about my home situation than I'd ever explicitly shared. You leave in 3 weeks. The pay differential is substantial hazard pay plus overseas adjustment. We're talking about doubling your quarterly income. That evening, I told Owen over dinner, watching his fork pause midway to his mouth. For months? His voice carried not concern but calculation. Why would they send you? Why not Harrison or Kumar? They have more seniority. Because I have the security clearance and the expertise, I replied, keeping my voice neutral despite the familiar sting of his doubt. A woman alone in Asia for 4 months, he muttered, returning to his plate. Seems unnecessary. Can't you do it remotely? Within an hour, Margaret had called, having received Owen's distress signal. Violet, dear. Her voice crackled through the speaker. I've just heard about this overseas assignment. Don't you think it's rather selfish? Leaving your husband for months. Marriage requires sacrifice, and it seems or so I've noticed you're only interested in your career. The security briefing 3 days later revealed complications I hadn't anticipated. Agent Patricia Yamamoto from the Defense Security Service explained that all personal assets had to be registered in federal databases. Your cabin in Pine Grove, she said, reading from her tablet, will be flagged as belonging to a cleared contractor working on sensitive projects. This provides additional protection against foreign interference or suspicious activity. My simple cabin had just become a federally monitored asset. The irony wasn't lost on me. The property Owen and his family dismissed as worthless was now under government protection. I spent the next 3 days arranging meticulous coverage for my absence. The property management company I hired came highly recommended their contracts, typically serving deployed military families. Every utility payment was automated, double-backed with the management company as secondary payers. I installed security cameras that uploaded directly to cloud storage accessible from anywhere in the world. The emergency folder I prepared for Owen contained 15 pages of detailed instructions, emergency contacts, utility companies, maintenance schedules, and explicit warnings about the cabin's federal status. I highlighted emergency access only in yellow marker, underlining it 3 times. Owen flipped through it with barely concealed amusement. It's just a shack in the woods, Violet, not Fort Knox. He laughed, tossing the folder onto the kitchen counter where it would remain untouched for the next 4 months. Singapore's humidity hit me like a wall when I stepped off the plane, but the sensation of freedom was stronger than any physical discomfort. My hotel room overlooked Marina Bay, the city's lights reflecting off water like scattered diamonds. That first night, I stood on the balcony and felt my shoulders drop from their permanent position near my ears. 4 months of not being dismissed, ignored, or belittled stretched ahead like a promise. The work was intensive but exhilarating. I uncovered a web of compliance issues that had cost the client millions in potential fines. My daily reports to James were met with praise that felt foreign after years of Owen's indifference. The client was impressed enough to request an extension, which I politely declined. 4 months was my limit. My weekly video calls with Owen became a study in declining interest. Initially, he managed 10 minutes of conversation, asking perfunctory questions about my work while his attention drifted to whatever was on his computer screen. By week 3, he was attending Margaret's dinners during our scheduled calls, the family chatter drowning out any attempt at meaningful conversation. Your absence is barely noticed, Margaret said once, loud enough to be heard through Owen's phone, followed by laughter I recognized as Mason's. Margaret's emails arrived like clockwork every Sunday evening. She'd forward articles about career women who lost their families or historical accounts of wives who'd abandoned their duties for personal ambition. Each message signed, "Concerned for your marriage, Margaret," as if her concern had ever extended beyond control. The family group chat, which I'd been part of for 6 years, suddenly showed an error message one morning. You are no longer a participant in this conversation. No explanation, no warning. Owen claimed it was a technical glitch when I asked, but his social media told a different story. Photos from family dinners showed him centered between Margaret and Richard, Mason's girlfriend, Sarah, occupying what had been my seat. The captions read like obituaries for my presence. Great evening with the whole family complete at last. My cabin's security cameras became my lifeline to something real. Every morning I checked the feeds while drinking coffee, watching deer wander through the yard or rain pattern the pond's surface. The weekly reports from the management company were brief, all systems normal, No issues to report, but they provided more comfort than Owen's increasingly sporadic messages. By month 3, Owen had stopped answering my calls altogether. Text messages received single-word responses hours later, busy, fine. Later, his social media, however, showed remarkable availability for dinner with colleagues, drinks with Mason, concerts with people I didn't recognize. Sarah Mason's girlfriend appeared in more photos, always laughing at something Owen had said, her hand occasionally on his shoulder in that casual way that wasn't casual at all. Sarah's perfectly manicured hand rested on Owen's shoulder in the last photo he'd posted, her smile too bright, her proximity too familiar. The timestamp showed last Tuesday when he'd claimed to be working late on quarterly reports. I closed the laptop and stared at the Singapore skyline, the city's pulse vibrating through my hotel window as I processed what those images meant. Not just indifference anymore, something else entirely. The flight home stretched across 16 hours and 3 time zones, plenty of time to prepare myself for whatever waited in Detroit. I texted Owen my arrival time twice, received nothing back. When the plane touched down on Thursday afternoon, the October air carried that particular Midwest chill that slices through everything. I waited 40 minutes at baggage claim, watching families reunite, couples embrace, drivers hold signs for strangers. No Owen. Finally, a text appeared. At Mom's preparing special dinner for your return. Come straight here. The taxi driver helped load my luggage into the trunk while I stared at those words. Special dinner at Margaret's. After 4 months away, my husband couldn't be bothered to meet me at the airport, but the Whitmore were orchestrating something that required preparation. The route home took us past our neighborhood, and I asked the driver to slow down as we passed our house. Through the living room window, I glimpsed furniture I didn't recognize, a leather sectional where our blue sofa should be, artwork on walls that had been bare when I left. The driveway held 2 cars I'd never seen before, a BMW newer than Owen's and something sporty in red. Our garden, which I'd carefully maintained for 3 years, had been replaced with generic landscaping. This your house? The driver asked, noticing my stare. I'm not sure anymore, I answered honestly. I had him drop me at the corner, hauling my suitcase to our front door like a stranger approaching an unfamiliar home. My key still worked, but the house inside wasn't mine. The leather furniture was real expensive. The art consisted of abstract pieces that Margaret would approve of. Safe, tasteless, costly. The kitchen had been reorganized completely, my carefully arranged spice rack gone, replaced by decorative canisters that probably held nothing. In our bedroom, was it still ours? The sheets were different, Egyptian cotton still in their packaging creases. The closet showed Owen's clothes expanded into my section, my remaining items compressed into a corner like an afterthought. On the dresser sat a bottle of perfume I didn't recognize, definitely not mine. I left my suitcase unopened and drove to the Whitmore house, my hands steady on the wheel despite the exhaustion pulling at my bones. Their driveway looked like a luxury car dealership. Margaret's Lexus, Richard's Mercedes, Mason's Range Rover, Owen's BMW, and 2 others I didn't recognize. The house glowed with warm light, shadows moving behind curtains like a stage play in progress. The front door was unlocked. I could hear voices from the dining room laughter that carried the particular pitch of celebration. Margaret's voice rose above the others. He handled it brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. I stood in the hallway listening to my absence being celebrated before stepping into view. The scene was orchestrated like a magazine spread. Margaret's heirloom crystal, the set she only used for Christmas and engagement announcements, sparkled under the chandelier. Decanters of wine that cost more than my weekly groceries stood open, breathing. Everyone had dressed for an occasion, Margaret in pearls and silk, Richard in his golf club blazer, Mason in what looked like a new suit. Owen stood at the head of the table, occupying the seat I usually took when we hosted, wearing the expression of a man who'd just won everything. Violet. Margaret's voice carried false warmth. Perfect timing. We were just about to toast. They'd arranged themselves around the table like an audience at a theater, each face holding that particular expression of barely contained excitement that preceded major announcements. Sarah was there too, seated next to Mason but angled toward Owen, her hand resting near his wine glass. "Welcome home," Owen said, not moving from his position of power at the table's head. "How was the flight?" Before I could answer, he raised his glass, commanding attention with an authority I'd never seen him display. "Actually, before we eat, I have something important to share." He paused, savoring the moment. You all know about Violet's little cabin, her impractical purchase 3 years ago? My shoulders tensed at his tone, the dismissive way he said little cabin like it was a child's plaything. Well, I finally did something about it. I sold it for $60,000 last month while she was overseas. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. The room erupted in applause, Richard's golf clap, Margaret's delighted gasp, Mason's whistle of appreciation. Sarah clapped too, her eyes never leaving Owen's face. Owen pointed to the elaborate spread on the table dishes I recognized as catered from the expensive French restaurant downtown. The money for this dinner? It's from the cabin sale. At least one meal is covered. His family laughed at this joke, this casual revelation that he'd stolen my sanctuary and used the money for their entertainment. I remained perfectly still, my silence complete, while my phone began vibrating in my pocket. Owen pulled out a leather folder, the kind expensive lawyers use spreading documents across Margaret's pristine tablecloth. The best part is how I handled everything myself, he boasted, running his finger along the pages. Researched comparables, managed 3 competing bids, saved thousands in agent fees. Brilliant, Richard murmured, leaning forward to examine the papers. Absolutely brilliant business instinct. How did you handle the signature issue? Mason asked, his question carrying genuine curiosity rather than concern. Owen's smile widened. Spent 3 days practicing. Got it perfect. He pointed to various signature lines, each showing my name and handwriting that was close to mine, but not quite right. The 5 in violet tilted wrong, the final T too sharp. Margaret examined the documents with approval. Resourcefulness, she declared. That's what I call resourcefulness. My phone buzzed again, Harrison Blackwell, attorney at law. I didn't recognize the name, but something in my gut told me this call would change everything happening in this room. I stepped away from the table, pressing the phone to my ear as I moved toward the French doors that led to Margaret's pristine back porch. Mrs. Whitmore. The man's voice cracked with an edge of panic that immediately set my nerves on alert. This is Harrison Blackwell. I represented the buyers in your cabin purchase. I mean, the sale your husband arranged. Through the glass doors, I watched Owen refill wine glasses, his mouth moving animatedly as he continued his performance for his captivated audience. Margaret touched his arm affectionately, the proud mother admiring her clever son. Sarah laughed at something Mason said, but her eyes tracked Owen's movements with an interest that went beyond casual observation. What can I help you with, Mr. Blackwell? I kept my voice steady, professional, though my pulse had begun to quicken. Why are federal authorities at our office? The words came out in a rush, his composure completely shattered. They're examining documents, asking about restricted property sales, talking about fraudulent transfers. They've seized our files. What kind of property did your husband sell us? Federal authorities. The words landed with the weight of vindication I hadn't expected. I moved further onto the porch, the October evening air sharp against my travel-worn skin. Mr. Blackwell, I've been overseas for 4 months. This is the first I'm hearing about any sale. Perhaps you should explain exactly what transaction you're referring to. The Pine Grove cabin. His breathing was audible through the phone. Your husband provided all the documentation, handled everything himself. We closed the deal 6 weeks ago, $60,000 transferred to your joint account. But now there are agents here talking about federal property registrations and security clearances. They're using words like fraud and forgery. 6 weeks ago, while I was in Singapore meticulously documenting compliance violations that would save the client millions, Owen had been forging my signature on federal documents. The irony was almost beautiful in its perfection. Mr. Blackwell, I said carefully, I need to review some documents and make some calls. I'll contact you within the hour. I ended the call and stood in Margaret's meticulously maintained garden, surrounded by roses she paid someone else to tend, processing what I had just learned. My phone showed 3 missed calls from a blocked number while I'd been speaking to Blackwell. As I scrolled through them, a text appeared from a number I recognized immediately. Special Agent Catherine Reeves. We'd met during my security clearance renewal 6 months ago, a thorough woman with sharp eyes who'd asked probing questions about every aspect of my life. Her message was brief, Mrs. Whitmore, aware of situation regarding your Pine Grove property. Maintain normal behavior. Attend family dinner as planned. Keep subjects unaware. Team mobilizing. The text had arrived 2 hours ago while my plane was descending into Detroit. Agent Reeves had known about the fraudulent sale before I'd even landed. The federal databases that tracked my cabin as a secured asset had flagged the unauthorized transfer, triggering an investigation that was now converging on this dinner party where Owen celebrated his criminal genius. I thought about the security briefing I'd attended before leaving for Singapore. Agent Yamamoto's careful explanation of how property owned by cleared contractors became part of a larger protective framework. The cabin wasn't just mine. It was tagged in federal systems as an asset that couldn't be transferred without multiple authorizations. Owen's forgery hadn't just stolen my property, he'd triggered alerts in databases he didn't know existed. Through the window, I watched him stand again, holding court at the head of the table. His hands moved expressively as he appeared to be explaining something, probably the detailed story of how he'd been so clever, so resourceful. Margaret's face glowed with maternal pride. Richard nodded approvingly at whatever business wisdom his son was sharing. They looked like a Renaissance painting of familial satisfaction, completely unaware that their golden boy had just confessed to federal crimes. I returned to the dining room, sliding my phone into my pocket where it vibrated with another message I didn't check. Owen paused mid-sentence as I entered, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Important call?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't actually care about the answer. "Just work following up on some documentation," I replied, taking my seat at the far end of the table, the place they'd assigned me like an afterthought. Owen laughed, the sound carrying an edge of condescension I knew too well. "Always working, even fresh off the plane. You should learn to relax, Violet." He turned back to his audience, eager to continue his story. The best part was accessing all the necessary documents. While Violet was gallivanting across Asia, I took the initiative to organize our financial papers, found everything in her home office, deed, title, insurance documents, all sitting there in her little safe. The combination she never bothered to change from our anniversary date. "Brilliant," Richard murmured. "Taking control of wasteful assets, that's what a real businessman does." Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Why let money sit idle in some cabin when it could be invested properly? Owen's been looking at some excellent opportunities in Mason's new venture." Mason leaned forward, suddenly interested. "We could definitely use the capital injection. My partner thinks we could triple the investment within 18 months. They were already spending my money, dividing up the proceeds from Owen's theft like pirates sharing treasure. Not one person at this table had asked why I hadn't been consulted about selling my own property. The assumption of Owen's authority was so complete, so unquestioned, that they couldn't conceive of his actions as criminal. "Your signature work was impressive," Mason said to Owen, grinning broadly. "Honestly, couldn't tell the difference from the real thing." 3 days of practice," Owen replied proudly. "I used her old journals to study her handwriting. The key is getting the pressure right, the way she curves certain letters." Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be so proud, Violet. Owen really took charge while you were gone." I met her gaze steadily, noting how her hand had moved to rest near Owen's on the table, their fingers almost touching. "Oh, yes," I replied. "He certainly took charge of something that wasn't his to take." The words hung in the air for a moment before Owen laughed them off. "Everything in a marriage is ours, darling. That's what partnership means." My phone vibrated again. Another text from Agent Reeves, 15 minutes. I watched the second hand on Margaret's grandfather clock sweep past the 12:14 minutes since Agent Reeves's last text. Owen had moved on to describing his future investment plans for the $60,000, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he had gotten away with everything. Margaret was serving her homemade tiramisu, the dessert she reserved for special victories, when the first black vehicle pulled silently into the driveway. The headlights swept across the dining room windows like searchlights, followed immediately by 2 more vehicles positioning themselves with military precision. Through the sheer curtains, I could see the government plates, the kind that made neighbors peer through blinds and wonder what level of trouble had arrived on their street. 6 figures emerged from the vehicles, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this many times before. I stood up from the table, my movement so sudden that Sarah's wine glass wobbled. "I'll get the door," I said, though no one had knocked yet. Owen barely glanced at me, too absorbed in explaining to Richard how he planned to leverage the cabin money into a larger real estate portfolio. I reached the front door just as Agent Catherine Reeves raised her hand to knock. She stood flanked by 5 other agents, all wearing the kind of dark suits that screamed federal authority. Her eyes met mine with professional recognition. She remembered me from the security clearance interview, remembered the woman who had sat across from her for 3 hours answering questions about every aspect of her life. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "are all the subjects present?" "They're in the dining room," I confirmed, stepping aside to let them enter. "They're having dessert." The agents moved through Margaret's hallway with practiced precision, their footsteps deliberate on her polished hardwood floors. Each footfall sounded like a countdown, marking the seconds until Owen's world collapsed. Agent Reeves led the way, her hand resting casually near her badge, ready to present credentials that would turn celebration into catastrophe. The dining room fell silent as 6 federal agents filed in, spreading out to block all exits with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. Owen's fork hung suspended halfway to his mouth, tiramisu sliding off onto Margaret's heirloom tablecloth. Richard's face drained of color so quickly I thought he might faint. Mason pressed back in his chair as if he could disappear into the wallpaper, while Sarah's eyes darted between the agents and the door, calculating distances she'd never be able to cross. "Owen Whitmore," Agent Reeves announced, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority that made everything else in the room seem suddenly trivial. She held up her badge, the gold shield catching the light from Margaret's chandelier. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit interstate commerce violations." The words landed like physical blows. Owen's wineglass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor in a cascade of crystal and merlot that spread across Margaret's Persian rug like blood. "This is insane." He shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. It was just a property deal, a simple real estate transaction. Agent Reeves moved toward him with unhurried confidence. "Selling federally registered property using forged documents isn't a simple transaction, Mr. Whitmore. It's a federal crime." The handcuffs appeared in her hands with practiced ease, the metal clicking around Owen's wrists with a finality that made Margaret scream. "There's been a mistake." Margaret's voice cracked, her hands fluttering to her pearls as if they could protect her from this reality. "This is a misunderstanding. Owen was just being resourceful." "We need to call our lawyer." Richard stood up, trying to summon the authority he commanded in boardrooms, but his voice shook as he spoke. "You can't just come into our home and—" "Sir, please sit down," one of the other agents instructed, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Richard sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. The agents began their systematic documentation of the scene. One photographed the forged documents still spread across the table, Owen's confession transformed into evidence. Another captured images of the champagne bottles, the elaborate dinner spread, the celebration that had been funded with stolen money. A third agent collected the family's phones, ignoring Sarah's protests about privacy and Mason's claims that he wasn't involved. Owen turned to me, his face cycling through emotions, confusion, anger, desperation before settling on something that looked like betrayal. "Violet, tell them this is a misunderstanding. You're my wife. Explain that I had every right to sell that property. Tell them." I met his gaze with the same steady silence I had perfected over 6 years of being dismissed, ignored, and belittled. The silence that had once been my prison now became my power. I said nothing, letting my lack of words speak volumes about years of accumulated injuries that had led to this moment. "Wives can't testify against husbands," he said desperately, grasping for legal straws he didn't understand. "You can't do this to me. I was helping our finances. I was being smart." Agent Reeves paused in her process of securing Owen's hands behind his back. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, spouses can absolutely testify in federal cases involving crimes against each other. But more importantly, we don't need your wife's testimony. The evidence you've provided tonight, your detailed confession to your family, the forged documents you displayed, the fraudulent sale of government-registered property, that's more than sufficient." She looked at me then, her expression professionally neutral but with something in her eyes that might have been understanding. "Mrs. Whitmore, we'll need you to come to the federal building tomorrow to provide a statement. Our financial crimes unit has uncovered additional irregularities that go beyond the cabin sale." Margaret's gasp was audible. "Additional irregularities?" Agent Reeves turned her attention to Owen's parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore Sr., you'll both need to come in for questioning as well." Your names appear on several suspicious transfers connected to this case. She paused, letting the implications sink in. It seems the cabin sale was just the beginning. Our forensic accountants have found evidence of systematic embezzlement from joint accounts, hidden investments, and what appears to be a pattern of financial fraud extending back several years. The family that had spent 6 years celebrating Owen's every minor achievement while dismissing everything I accomplished now sat frozen, watching their golden child being led away in handcuffs. Their dynasty of judgment and casual cruelty was crumbling in real time, brought down by Owen's own arrogance and their enthusiastic participation in celebrating his crimes. Mason stood frozen against the dining room wall, his face pale as one of the agents began reading him his rights as a material witness. Sarah had collapsed into a chair, mascara streaming down her cheeks as she repeatedly insisted she barely knew any of them despite the photos on Owen's phone showing her at family gatherings for the past 8 months. Margaret clutched at the agent nearest to her, begging to accompany Owen, while Richard sat with his head in his hands, muttering something about calling their attorney who, ironically, had been disbarred 2 years prior for his own financial improprieties. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost surreal. I sat in my kitchen now, not ours, drinking coffee from the mug I'd bought myself in Singapore, watching the sunrise paint the walls gold. My phone had been vibrating non-stop since midnight, with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, journalists who'd somehow gotten my contact information, and Margaret's repeated attempts to reach me, despite being explicitly told not to contact me by federal agents. The first domino fell within 48 hours. Premier Title Services, the company that had processed Owen's fraudulent sale, found federal investigators at their door Monday morning. By noon, their license had been suspended pending investigation. The owner, Bradley Morrison, gave a panicked interview to local news, claiming they'd followed standard procedures. But the forged documents Owen had provided were so obviously fraudulent that their failure to verify authorization constituted gross negligence. Morrison's 30-year career in real estate ended in a single morning, his reputation destroyed by Owen's transaction. 3 real estate agents who'd advised Owen on pricing and strategy faced their own reckoning. Jennifer Patterson, who'd provided comparable sales data, lost her license when investigators discovered she'd never verified Owen's ownership of the property. Robert Clean, who'd connected Owen with potential buyers, was found to have ignored multiple red flags in the documentation. Sandra Marsh, who'd celebrated the sale on her professional social media, claiming credit for facilitating another successful transaction, watched her 20-year career evaporate when screenshots of her posts became evidence of professional negligence. Margaret's Facebook posts became particularly damaging. Her proud declaration that my brilliant son just made the deal of the year, accompanied by photos of the celebration dinner, had been shared 16 times before the arrests. Neighbors who'd always found the Whitmores insufferable gleefully provided screenshots to investigators her post from 3 weeks earlier, so proud of Owen taking charge, while his wife gallivants across Asia became evidence of premeditation. The country club ladies she'd bragged to about Owen's business acumen now crossed the street to avoid her. Harrison Blackwell's law firm imploded spectacularly. The buyers, an innocent couple named David and Jennifer Chin, who'd thought they were purchasing a weekend retreat, sued everyone involved. Their lawsuit named Blackwell's firm, the title company, all 3 real estate agents, Owen, and even attempted to include me before their attorney realized I was the victim. Blackwell's partners voted him out within a week, his name scraped from the building's directory before the paint was dry on the federal subpoenas. 6 months of investigation revealed the scope of Owen's deception went far beyond the cabin. Federal forensic accountants discovered he'd been siphoning money from our joint accounts for years, funding failed investments and unauthorized loans to his family. Every transaction told a story of entitlement and theft. $20,000 to Mason for his revolutionary drop shipping business that never shipped a single item. $15,000 to Richard for golf club memberships and gambling debts he'd hidden from Margaret. The steady stream of smaller amounts, $500 here, $1,000 there, that funded Owen's lunches with Sarah, their weekend trips I'd never known about, gifts for a relationship that had apparently been developing while I worked overseas. Judge Patricia Thornton presided over Owen's sentencing with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many entitled men believe the rules didn't apply to them. The federal courthouse in downtown Detroit had the kind of imposing architecture designed to remind defendants of the government's power. Owen sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit properly. 6 months in federal detention had stripped away his casual arrogance along with 15 pounds. Your Honor, Owen began his allocution, his voice lacking the confidence that had once commanded boardrooms and family dinners. I meant no harm. I was simply trying to maximize underutilized assets. In marriage, property is shared. I believed I had every right to make financial decisions for our family's benefit. Judge Thornton removed her glasses, cleaning them slowly before responding. Mr. Whitmore, you've just confessed to premeditation and systematic planning. You didn't make a financial decision, you committed wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Your detailed explanation of researching prices, practicing signatures, and avoiding legal fees doesn't minimize your culpability. It confirms it. The sentence came down like a sledgehammer. 4 years in federal prison, no possibility of early release, plus $285,000 in restitution. The man who'd committed federal crimes to avoid $1,000 in legal fees now owed more than he'd earned in a decade. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the number sank in. Owen's attorney, a public defender, since no private lawyer would take his case, slumped in his chair. Margaret and Richard faced their own legal consequences. The investigation revealed they'd received over $50,000 in stolen funds over the year's money they'd spent on cruise vacations and country club fees, while knowing their son's income couldn't support such generosity. They stood before a different judge 2 weeks later, their attorney arguing they were merely naive parents who'd trusted their son. The prosecutor's response was devastating. Email evidence showed they'd actively encouraged Owen to take control of family finances while I was overseas. Mason surprised everyone by flipping immediately. Faced with potential conspiracy charges, he provided prosecutors with detailed testimony about family discussions regarding my cabin, Owen's planning sessions, and their parents' knowledge of the scheme in exchange for probation and community service. He became the star witness against his own family. His testimony revealed years of casual discussions about my wasteful spending on the cabin, strategies to access my accounts, and Margaret's suggestion that Owen handle things while I was abroad. Mason's testimony concluded with him looking directly at his parents, his voice steady as he described years of financial manipulation he'd witnessed, but never questioned until federal agents showed him the evidence. They knew, he said simply. We all knew Violet's money was being taken. We just called it family finances. The courtroom had gone silent at that admission, even the court reporter pausing before continuing her transcription. 3 weeks after the final sentencing, I returned to my cabin for the first time since Owen's arrest. The property management company had maintained it perfectly during the chaos, but now federal restitution funds had transformed it into something beyond my original vision. The narrow dirt road had been properly graded and graveled. New security cameras, discreet but comprehensive, monitored every approach. The front door bore a new deadbolt system that required both a key and a code, installed by the same company that secured federal facilities. Inside, the transformation continued. The kitchen I'd planned to renovate someday had been completely rebuilt, new appliances, granite countertops, cabinets that closed smoothly instead of requiring the specific angle I'd memorized. The windows throughout had been replaced with triple-pane glass that turned the pine grove outside into a living painting, every needle sharp against the sky. The creaky deck had been reinforced and extended, now wrapping around 2 sides of the cabin with built-in benches that faced the pond. Agent Catherine Reeves arrived on a Tuesday morning, pulling up in her personal vehicle rather than the government sedan. She carried 2 cups of coffee from the shop in town, remembering my preference for oat milk without my having mentioned it. We sat on the new deck, the October air crisp but not cold, watching mist rise from the pond. The investigation has expanded, she said, her professional tone softened by something that might have been admiration. Your case broke open something bigger. Owen had been running similar schemes with 3 other families, targeting women whose assets he could access through his position at the bank. She explained how my cabin's federal protection had been the tripwire that exposed everything. Without that classification, Owen might have continued indefinitely, stealing from women who trusted their finances to institutions where he held influence. The FBI had recovered nearly $500,000 in stolen funds, though much had already been spent on the Whitmore family's lifestyle. The divorce proceedings took place entirely through lawyers. Michigan law showed no mercy to imprisoned spouses who'd committed financial crimes against their partners. The judge, an older woman named Carolyn Foster, had reviewed the evidence with visible disgust. "Mrs. Chin," she said, using my maiden name, which I'd legally reclaimed, "the court awards you all marital assets without exception." Everything came to me. The house in the suburbs with its expensive furniture I didn't want, the joint savings Owen hadn't managed to steal, the investment accounts he'd hidden poorly, even Margaret's heirloom crystal that she'd specifically designated for Owen in her will. The crystal was particularly satisfying. 12 place settings of Waterford that had been in her family for generations, now sitting in boxes in my basement, waiting for donation to charity. Owen's letters began arriving 6 weeks into his sentence. The first was angry, accusing me of orchestrating everything, of knowing about the federal protection and setting him up. The second came a month later, shifting to self-pity, lamenting his circumstances and the unfairness of his situation. By the third letter, hints of understanding crept in, not remorse exactly, but recognition that his clever plan hadn't been clever at all. "I found out about the federal property classifications," he wrote in what would be his final letter. "They explained it during legal education class here. I should have asked questions. I should have asked you." He never apologized, never acknowledged the years of theft before the cabin, never mentioned the pain of being invisible in my own marriage. He simply stopped writing, perhaps finally understanding that his words, like his presence, were no longer welcome in my life. The local newspaper ran the story for weeks. "Suburban Scandal, Wife's Cabin Exposes Years of Financial Fraud" became the most read article in the paper's digital history. Reporters called constantly, offering payment for exclusive interviews, promising to tell my side of the story. I declined them all. The federal investigation's findings were public record pages of documentation that spoke more eloquently than any interview could. The facts themselves were vindication enough. Owen in federal prison, his parents bankrupted by restitution payments, their reputation destroyed by their own greed. My neighbors' attitudes shifted completely. Where once they'd seen Owen's quiet wife, who rarely spoke at block parties, they now saw someone who'd endured years of financial abuse while building her own success. Janet from next door brought casseroles during the divorce proceedings. Mike from across the street offered to maintain my lawn without payment. The invitations to coffee and book clubs multiplied, though I politely declined most, preferring the solitude I'd earned. The consulting work flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. My experience with international compliance, combined with the notoriety of my case, made me highly sought after. Companies wanted someone who understood both technical complexities and the human element of financial crime. My rates tripled, then quadrupled. Working from the cabin's converted second bedroom overlooking the pond through those crystal-clear windows, I earned more in 6 months than Owen had stolen in 6 years. Ruth Morrison, the elderly woman who'd sold me the cabin, sent a card on the anniversary of the sale. "I knew you needed this place," she wrote in careful cursive. "Harold would be pleased to know it sheltered you when you needed it most." On the first anniversary of that dinner, that horrible, wonderful dinner where Owen announced his crime to his celebrating family, I sat on my reinforced deck as the sun set through the pines. The wine wasn't special, just a bottle from the local grocery store, chosen because I liked the label. No one would judge this choice. No one would comment on its price or vintage. The silence around me was complete, broken only by natural sounds, whined through pine needles, water lapping at the pond's edge, an owl calling from somewhere in the darkness. My phone sat silent on the table beside me, containing no contacts from that previous life. No Whitmore family group chat, no passive-aggressive messages from Margaret, no dismissive texts from Owen. The absence of their voices revealed how much space they'd occupied, how their constant judgment had shaped my days.